My presentation today is from my upcoming book called Half American. It aims to tell the definitive history of Black Americans in World War II. It'll be published in fall of 2022 by Viking Books, and I'm excited to give you a sneak peek of some of my research. Let me start by taking us back 80 years. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, James Gratz Thompson, a 26-year-old from Wichita, could not sleep. He had registered with the Selective Service the prior year, and now, with the US declaring war on Japan and Germany, it was only a matter of time before he was drafted. The prospect of war was frightening for many civilians, but something else was on his mind that cold Kansas night. Sitting in his family's home in a vibrant Black neighborhood amidst a segregated American city, Thompson wrote a letter expressing the concerns that he and many other Black Americans felt about joining a racially segregated military. Thompson asked, "Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Will things be better for the next generation in the peace to follow? Would it be demanding too much to demand full citizenship rights in exchange for the sacrifice of my life? Is the kind of America I know worth defending?" Printed in the Pittsburgh Courier, an influential Black newspaper, Thompson's letter launched the African American Double Victory campaign during World War II to secure victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. I have not been able to shake these words from my head as I worked on this book over the past several years. Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? These words are as relevant today as they were some 8 decades ago. I've drawn the title for my book from Thompson's letter, Half American. As I've worked on this book for the past several years, I've been struck by how differently the war looks when Black Americans are at the center of the story. When World War II is viewed from the African American perspective, 2 important truths emerge. The first is that Black troops played an essential role in helping the United States and allies win World War II. A global war required logistics on a scale that surprised even America's military planners, and Black troops formed the backbone of the US military's logistical forces. Black troops fought courageously when given the opportunity in combat, but it was this behind-the-scenes support and supply work that helped the Allies win the war. The second is that Black Americans saw World War II as a fight against racism abroad and at home. Black Americans understood the war as a fight over ideas and policies as much as a battle over territory and resources. This meant defeating Nazi Germany and the Axis powers was only half the battle. Winning the war would only be a partial victory if the United States did not also overturn racial discrimination at home. This was called the Double Victory Campaign: victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. For Black Americans, the fight against white supremacy continued long after the surrender of the Axis nations. Black veterans returned from the war and became key players in the civil rights movement across the country. For decades after World War II, Black veterans fought for the principles of democracy in America. During today's presentation, I'll focus on several vignettes related to Black Americans in the Pacific Theater. Let me begin on one of the most pivotal days in American history. Shortly before 8 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, mess attendant second class Doris Miller was in the galley of the USS West Virginia, gathering dirty laundry, when he heard the low drone of dozens of planes flying over Pearl Harbor's Battleship Row. Miller, a Black messman from Waco, Texas, was about to distinguish himself as a hero during the attack that drew the United States into World War II. He heard a bugle call for a fire and rescue crew and several explosions, distant but getting closer. Initially, he thought it was a drill, but then remembered it was Sunday morning, an unusual time for so much commotion. As Miller struggled to comprehend what was happening, a torpedo struck the West Virginia, dislodging the rudder and sending a giant geyser of water over the ship's stack, crashing down on the deck. Minutes later, more torpedoes pounded the West Virginia, knocking out the electricity and causing the ship to list rapidly to port. As the general alarm sounded, Miller rushed to his battle station in the middle of the ship. When he arrived, he saw that his station had been destroyed by the barrage. Amidst the explosions and anti-aircraft fire, Miller heard officers calling for all available men to go topside. A former football player and shipboard boxing champion, the 22-year-old Miller was strong and athletic, but he had trouble navigating his 6'3" 200-pound frame through the dark, smoke-filled corridors of the tilting and flooding ship. Torpedoes and bombs continued to rock the ship, tossing those below deck into hard metal walls and flinging men above deck into the flaming, oil-choked harbor water. When Miller finally made it topside, the morning's chaos came into clearer view. The planes bore the Empire of Japan's red ball symbol. From the deck of the West Virginia, he could see flames and giant plumes of smoke coming from the nearby USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma. The West Virginia had been stationed at Pearl Harbor for months to guard against a potential attack, and Miller knew Black messmen on the other ships. On shore leave, the messmen would swap stories about ports they had visited in the Caribbean and South America, and about the indignities, large and small, of cooking and cleaning for white officers. They wondered when the United States would officially enter the World War. Now, with smoke blotting out the sun over Oahu, they had their answer. Miller had little time to process the horrible realities of war unfolding before him. On the upper deck, the lieutenant commander spotted Miller and enlisted the powerful Texan to help him carry the ship's commander, whose abdomen had been sliced open by a piece of metal from a bomb explosion. Using a makeshift stretcher, Miller helped move his mortally wounded captain to a sheltered spot below the navigation bridge. A lieutenant then ordered Miller to quickly follow him to a pair of unmanned 50 caliber anti-aircraft machine guns. Despite having no training on the ship's weapons, Miller loaded ammunition and fired at the Japanese planes that continued to buzz overhead. It wasn't hard, Miller later recalled. I just pulled the trigger and she worked fine. I had watched the others with these guns. I guess I fired her for about 15 minutes. I think I got one of those Japanese planes. They were diving pretty close to us, Miller said. Their ammunition spent, Miller and his lieutenant used a fire hose to beat back the flames on the deck and pulled several sailors out of the burning water. With the West Virginia sinking into the harbor, Miller and his surviving shipmates climbed hand over hand down a rope suspended from a boat crane and into the water. They swam nearly a quarter mile to shore, dodging patches of flaming oil as the bodies of their fallen countrymen floated in the water. Japanese planes continued to menace the skies. While it would be several weeks before Miller's name was released to the public, word quickly spread that a Black messman had performed heroically at Pearl Harbor. This story resonated with African Americans because over the prior decade, military leaders had gone out of their way to disparage Black servicemen. The Army argued that Black people lacked the intelligence, courage, and skill to serve in combat, and relegated Black troops to service roles. At the start of the war, the Marine Corps did not allow any Black men to serve. In the Navy, policies dictated that Black Americans could only be drafted or volunteer for the messman branch, where they would serve and feed white officers. And all of the military was racially segregated. This policy of segregation was costly and inefficient because it required the construction and maintenance of separate and redundant training facilities, as well as additional logistical planning for troop transportation deployments. Segregation made no sense for a military that was about to fight a global war on an unprecedented scale. For Black Americans, Doris Miller's heroism at Pearl Harbor was a rebuke of the military's policy of segregation. Miller showed that Black men could perform bravely in combat if only given the opportunity. Enemy torpedoes made no distinction between white sailors and Black messmen, they argued, so why should the Navy? This anger flowed through the pages of the Black press after Pearl Harbor. The front page headline in the Chicago Defender after the attack read, "Awake, white America, the hour is at hand." The editors wrote, "White America must now learn that a Negro in the armed service of his country, in the uniform of his government, must be respected as a defender of democracy. He cannot be insulted in his uniform that now represents a sacred cause. He must not be spat upon, jailed, beaten, cursed, and otherwise abused and tormented, as has been the case, then called upon to sacrifice his life for those who hold his patriotism so cheaply." Before striking back against Japan, the newspaper called for white Americans to first bomb the color line. The Defender's front page also profiled 3 young Chicagoans who heeded the radio appeals from Army recruiters to remember Pearl Harbor and attempted to volunteer for military service. 21-year-old Edgar Davis, 19-year-old Lewis Grady, and 20-year-old Mitchell Jordan stood in line with hundreds of other men, but were turned away by the recruiting officer because the Army did not have enough all-Black units to accommodate them. "Don't you accept American citizens in this Army?" Davis asked. Just imagine what this would feel like, to volunteer to serve your country after the attack on Pearl Harbor, only to be turned away because of the color of your skin. It was humiliating and infuriating. In the editorial page of The Crisis, Roy Wilkins argued that 13 million Black Americans were fighting for a new world, which shall not only which not only shall not contain a Hitler, but not Hitlerism, a world in which lynching, brutality, terror, humiliation, and degradation through segregation and discrimination shall have no place, either here or there. Reflecting his frustration over the War Department meeting, Wilkins charged that the fight against Hitlerism must begin in Washington, D.C. and must attack the military system of racial segregation. A lily white Navy cannot fight for a free world, he argued. A Jim Crow army cannot fight for a free world. It was not enough to fight for freedom and democracy on foreign battlefields if freedom and democracy remained out of reach for Black Americans at home. Doris Miller was not the only Black American at Pearl Harbor, and the sacrifices these Black messmen made during the attack were nowhere more evident than in the communities that mourned them. In Birmingham, Alabama, more than 300 people filled the pews at the 16th Street Baptist Church for a memorial service to honor Julius Ellsbury, a 20-year-old mess attendant first class on the USS Oklahoma. Ellsbury volunteered for the Navy as soon as he turned 18, and on the morning of December 7th, he helped several shipmates reach safety before he was killed. As his parents and six younger siblings sat in the church's front row, his mother thought of how Julius had written her just days before the attack to apologize for missing Christmas for the second year in a row. He enclosed a money order to buy presents for his family. The next letter she received was an official telegram from the Navy saying that her son was lost in action in the line of duty in the service of his country. She was devastated to lose her son. Nothing could bring Julius back, but she took pride in seeing his Navy picture displayed prominently in homes and businesses throughout Black Birmingham with the message, "Remember Pearl Harbor." The local newspaper editor compared Ellsbury to Crispus Attucks, the Black hero who was the first American killed in the American Revolution. No man, not even an admiral, can give more to his country than his life, the editor wrote. The memorial service for Private Robert Brooks made it clear that the military could not always police racial boundaries despite their best efforts. Brooks, a tank driver with the 192nd Tank Battalion, had just arrived at Clark Field in the Philippines when Japan's Pacific attack began. A Japanese bomb killed him early in the afternoon of December 8th, making him the first U.S. Armored Forces casualty of the war. Commanding General Jacob Devers, chief of the Armored Force, ordered that the main parade ground at Kentucky's Fort Knox be renamed Brooks Field in honor of the fallen private. Devers invited Brooks's parents, sharecroppers in rural Kentucky, to attend the dedication ceremony on December 23rd. It was an impressive event with six generals in attendance and a bugler sounding taps in the tank driver's honor. It was not until the parents arrived at the dedication ceremony that Devers and the Army learned that Brooks was Black. The draft board had recorded him as white, and the light-skinned Brooks declined to correct their error. Devers remained generous in his praise of Brooks. The general told the crowd, "In death, there is no greater rank. And in this, the greatest democracy the world has ever known, neither riches nor poverty, neither creed nor race, draws a line of demarcation in this hour of national crisis." Devers delivered his bold speech without a sense of irony at a segregated base, in a segregated army, in a segregated state. Still, one Black newspaper wished the Army and Navy would print the speech and post copies at every camp and on every ship. Even as Black Americans joined their fellow citizens in preparing for war abroad, they also continued to fight racism and violence at home. Just 2 months after Pearl Harbor, a 26-year-old mill worker named Cleo Wright was brutally lynched in Sikeston, Missouri. The killing sent shockwaves throughout the country. Civil rights activists called for a federal investigation, and dozens of ordinary Black citizens also wrote to President Roosevelt, including a Black father who asked, "Is this the democracy we're trying to teach the world?" A Black Army draftee encouraged his fellow soldiers to remember Cleo as we die for democracy. The New York Times suggested that the lynching gave comfort to the Nazis, while the Cleveland Post wrote that the Missouri mob proved to America and the world that they could out-Hitler Hitler in brutal savagery. Several newspapers stressed the lynching's international implications, noting that Germany and Japan used Sikeston as anti-America propaganda. In Missouri, local civil rights activists organized a mass rally in St. Louis. Over 3,500 people filled the YMCA gymnasium and listened to speakers call for federal anti-lynching legislation. Protesters carried signs reading, "Remember Pearl Harbor, remember Sikeston too." This slogan caught on and was repeated at protest meetings and in Black newspapers across the country over the next several years. Just weeks after Pearl Harbor, the stakes of World War II were clear for Black Americans. Defeating the Axis powers was an important national priority for which thousands of Black people would risk their lives. But defeating fascism on foreign battlefields was only half the fight. Victory would be incomplete unless it also uprooted racism in America. These dual war aims coalesced under a slogan that came to define the Black American experience during the war: double victory. Thousands of Black troops went overseas in the months after Pearl Harbor, but decisions about when and where to deploy Black troops were shaped by racial prejudices and policies in allied nations. Australia, for example, desperately needed allied support to fend off Japanese attacks, but their government maintained immigration restriction policies that barred non-Europeans from the country. With this white Australia policy in place, Australia asked the United States not to send Black troops down under. American officials were reluctant to disrupt racial norms in an allied nation, but felt that the war emergency demanded a quick ramp up in the region. They sent thousands of Black American troops to Australia in the early months of 1942, though military leaders assured the Australian government that they would station them in remote areas and away from cities. The Black troops in the 96th Engineered General Service Regiment arrived in Australia in the midst of this convoluted compromise. Near Townsville, on the northeast coast of Queensland, the engineers cleared 4 turf runways, each over a mile long, that enabled Allied planes to patrol the air over the Coral Sea. The battalion moved to Port Moresby near the end of April 1942, becoming the first American troops to land in New Guinea. They immediately got to work building landing strips and bridges, laying macadam roads, and installing pumps and water mains. "We did some of just about everything to be done," said Private Leon Thomas of New Orleans. The engineers performed this grueling labor while Japanese planes strafed and bombed the island day and night. The work was urgent because American military intelligence had intercepted and deciphered messages suggesting that the Japanese were planning a major offensive on Port Moresby in early May. While the 96th fortified the southeastern tip of New Guinea, 4 US Navy aircraft carriers and dozens of warships descended on the area to thwart the invasion. The American and Japanese fleets played a game of cat and mouse in the Coral Sea. The Japanese sank an American tanker and destroyer, while both sides searched for their opponent's carriers before finally engaging directly on May 8th. Aboard the USS Lexington during the Battle of the Coral Sea, Mess Attendant Elvin Bell fought fires amidst explosions of gasoline vapors and ammunition, and ventured below deck to rescue 3 trapped shipmates. The 20-year-old former foster child from Jamaica, Queens, in New York City was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his heroism. The Battle of the Coral Sea was a draw, but it stopped the Empire of Japan's unchecked advance across the region. A month later, the US Navy scored a decisive victory at the Battle of Midway, turning the tide in the Pacific War. Fighting in the Pacific was laborious and brutal. The Allies sought to seize key islands, kill, capture, and drive out Japanese soldiers, and build airships and ports. The goal of this island hopping strategy was to bring the war closer and closer to Japan. From New Guinea to the Solomon Islands, Black troops played a crucial role in the Allies' success. Brigadier General Hanford McNeater praised the work of the 96 engineers. He told the troops, "You've had a part in the building and upkeep of all of our airfields, and thus you've helped make possible the destruction of the Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea, the flying of the infantry over the mountains. You've contributed your share to every crack we've taken at the Japanese. You've carried out important work projects, even unloaded ships so we could eat and fight. You've built roads and mains which give us power and light. You're one of the workingest outfits in this man's army. All of us here are proud of you. All America will be proud of you when your record gets into the histories." Fighting a global war required a massive logistical undertaking to link the continental US to battlefronts around the world. On a map, these supply lines looked neat and orderly, so many air, land, and sea routes crisscrossing the globe. On the ground, it was clear that building, maintaining, and defending these supply lines required a tremendous amount of work. Starting early in the war, Black troops played a vital role across the Pacific, building runways, roads, and other critical infrastructure. It was a preview of the work Black troops would do later in the war, transporting vital war supplies inland from the beaches of Normandy in building the 1,000-mile-long Lido Road between India and China. Black troops did the dirty, arduous work that was vital to the Allies' military strategy. While Black troops were initially barred from taking up combat roles in World War II, an important barrier fell in the Pacific Theater in the spring of 1944, when the 24th Infantry Regiment and the 93rd Infantry Division became the first Black infantry troops to see combat in the war. Earlier in the year, the Allies had largely seized control of the Pacific and began to pressure Japan from two directions. General Douglas MacArthur led an offensive in the Southwest Pacific, while forces led by Admiral Chester Nimitz pushed through the Central Pacific. Both campaigns fought from island to island, attempting to collapse Japan's defensive perimeter, sever enemy lines of supply and communication, and seize islands close enough for B-29 long-range bombers to reach the mainland. Black infantry troops arrived as reinforcements at Bougainville Island, halfway between New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, after the majority of Japanese soldiers had been defeated. Fletcher P. Martin, Louisville Defender editor and war correspondent, embedded with the infantry and told Black Americans how their boys were doing in the Pacific. He painted a picture of a brutal conflict. Black soldiers on jungle patrols tripped over the twisted, bloated corpses of enemy dead. Flamethrowers, bayonets, and sniper fire became part of everyday life. A repulsive stench permeated the damp air. In his dispatches, Martin eagerly touted the fighting skills of Black infantry in order to refute the Army's belief that Black men lacked the courage necessary for combat. He accompanied a small band of troops, led by a young lieutenant from Washington, D.C., as they scampered up a jungle crag in pursuit of retreating Japanese forces. Martin wrote, "During the inky blackness of night and a pelting rain, the enemy attacked the Negro troops with knives, grenades, and rifle fire. This correspondent felt death's hot breath very close. Our troops fought with viciousness and valor, meeting steel with steel in hand-to-hand encounters. Black troops blew up enemy pillboxes with grenades and fired point blank into enemy trenches. The Black infantry experienced a baptism on Bougainville," Martin concluded. Like his white counterpart, war correspondent Ernie Pyle, Martin laid bare the terrible human cost of war. After spending several months in Bougainville, he wrote, "In the days to come, there'll be more deaths, still more deaths. They're inescapable. It's part of the price. We who have watched know the horror of the whole picture. And whether it's a black body, white body, yellow body, the scene is no less horrible." Reading back over his dispatches, Martin worried that readers would see the Black infantry as hardened and emotionless. He wrote, "Those of us here look upon the 24th Infantry not as an invincible bunch of professional killers, but as a small family which has been called upon to do an unpleasant job. They are average Americans who prior to the war were men doing varied things to earn a living. When the call came for duty, they answered." Like all soldiers, Black infantrymen in the Pacific enjoyed getting mail from home. Mail call brought love letters from wives and girlfriends, clippings from Black newspapers and magazines, and pictures of children born or grown taller since their fathers deployed. Letters brought news that the USS Liscum Bay was hit by a torpedo from a Japanese submarine in the Battle of Macon near the Gilbert Islands and sank in less than a half hour. Among the 644 sailors who lost their lives was Cook Third Class Doris Miller, the hero of Pearl Harbor. Another letter the troops received was from the mother of a soldier in the 24th Infantry who'd been killed in action. With a shaky hand, she wrote that she had received the official telegram from the War Department notifying her of her son's death. She thanked his fellow troops for the nice things they said about him. "I'm glad he was a good soldier," she wrote. "He was a good son." While racism was pervasive in all branches of the military, the Marine Corps stood out for its hostility to Black Americans. From 1798 until 1942, the Marines refused Black Americans the opportunity to serve. After President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802 in June 1941, banning discriminatory employment practices by federal agencies, he and U.S. Navy Secretary Frank Knox directed Marine Corps Commandant Thomas Holcomb to accept Black recruits. Holcomb complained that he would rather have a Marine Corps of 5,000 white men than 25,000 Black men, that integration would destroy the Corps' efficiency, and that if Black people wanted to serve, they could join the Army instead. Reluctantly, the Corps began accepting Black recruits in June 1942 and sent them to train at Montford Point, a segregated training facility adjoined to Camp Lejeune in coastal southeastern North Carolina. Thousands of Black Montford Point Marines served courageously in the Pacific Theater. The Black Marines who came ashore in the first waves on Saipan were in depot and ammunition companies. Their primary job was to unload ships, distribute ammunition, and keep the 2nd and 4th Marine Division supplied. But under heavy fire, they quickly took on combat roles. We got caught in the early part of Saipan in the Japanese counterattack, remembered Kenneth Rollick, a 19-year-old Marine from Harlem. He said, about a quarter mile from the beach, they came out screaming, and we just opened up. Anything moving, we shot at. The Marines dug foxholes on the beach and scurried forward from position to position. I watched those Negro boys carefully, said Lieutenant Joe Grimes, a white Texan. They were under intense mortar and artillery fire, as well as rifle and machine gun fire. They all kept on advancing until the counterattack was stopped. Private First Class Kenneth Jewel Tibbs, a 19-year-old from Ohio, was among the Black Marines who fought at Saipan. Like Rollick, Tibbs had enlisted the prior year, and after he shipped out, he wrote regularly to his girlfriend, who was pregnant. Their daughter, Helen, was born a month after an enemy bullet passed behind Tibbs's ear, felling him on the beach. He was the first Black Marine to be killed in action in the war. Private Vincent Long from Hempstead, New York, was fighting alongside Tibbs. He said, until then, I'd never had anyone's blood on me before. It was tough going, and everything was coming down on us. I picked up a Browning automatic rifle and started shooting like everyone else. Unlike the 92nd Infantry in Europe, the Montford Point Marines were heralded for their combat performance. Time War correspondent Robert Sherrod said, Negro Marines, under fire for the first time, have rated a universal 4.0, the U.S. Naval Academy mark of perfection on Saipan. He continued, credited with being the workingest men on Saipan, they performed prodigious feats of labor, both while under fire and after beachheads were well secured. Lieutenant James Wilson said, the Black Marines were damn good jungle fighters and praised their patience and combat efficiency. The Chicago Defender, an influential Black newspaper, said, when the Battle of Saipan is recorded for history, it will not be complete unless these Negro Marines are given full credit for their contribution to the victory. The erroneous statement that they cannot master the intricacies of modern warfare has been disproved by the heroic deeds of untrained Negro messmen in the Navy, shattered by the unparalleled success of the Negro flyers in Europe, and buried by the fighting quality of the Negro Marines in Saipan. The most important praise for the Montford Point Marines came from Lieutenant General Alexander Vandegrift, who succeeded Holcomb as Marine Corps Commandant. After their performance at Saipan, Vandegrift declared, the Negro Marines are no longer on trial. They are Marines, period. Saipan was a bloody turning point in the Pacific War. While some Montford Point Marines stayed in the Mariana Islands to guard ports, airstrips, and supply depots, almost 900 others ventured 700 miles north to Iwo Jima. By the time Operation Detachment started on February 19, 1945, Black Marines had experienced combat, but the fighting on Iwo Jima was still shockingly ferocious. Sergeant Thomas McFadder landed on the beach on the first day of the battle. As his landing craft approached the coast, he saw dead bodies bobbing in the water all around him. His unit crawled on their bellies, moving slowly up the beach. McFadder said, I jumped in a foxhole, and there was a young white Marine holding his family pictures. He had been hit by shrapnel. He was bleeding from the ears, nose, and mouth. It frightened me. The only thing I could do was lie there and repeat the Lord's Prayer over and over and over. Scrambling out of his foxhole, McFadder joined other Black Marines unloading ships and moving supplies ashore under heavy fire. From the time we landed on the beach, the tempo of activity was high, said Archibald Mosley, a 20-year-old from Carbondale, Illinois. Mosley and his unit supplied assault troops with weapons, food, water, and other supplies, enabling the Marines to push forward. We were also doing everything else we could to just stay alive, Mosley remembered. Black troops from Army port companies and amphibian truck companies attached to the Marines for the assault ran circuits between ship and shore, delivering hundreds of tons of ammunition and supplies. Black truck drivers landed with 105 millimeter howitzers to bolster the Marines' firepower. Our job was not only to land the first artillery, but to move it inland to pre-designated positions, said First Sergeant Houston Austin. The Ducks had a hell of a time making it to shore. Mortar fire filled many ships full of holes, while the high surf swamped others. Some drivers made half a dozen attempts to scale the beach's steep incline, under heavy fire all the while. Austin said, "We had drivers who had ducks shot out from under them, then came back for more. I had to order several men off their ducks after they had worked 48 hours unloading ammunition, where one hit would have blown everything nearby sky high." A white platoon leader said Black amphibious truck drivers made the difference between taking the island and handing it back to the Japanese. The island was so small that there was no space to safely withdraw and get out of range of enemy fire. "The whole island is a front," as one veteran put it. The courage American troops displayed led Admiral Nimitz to say that among the men who fought on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. As with the Normandy invasion, Black troops played critical logistical roles on Iwo Jima. Military leaders expected the attack to last only a few days. Instead, it took more than a month. Food, ammunition, and medical support were all positioned offshore on naval ships. "There's no supermarket down the street in a war zone," recalled Joseph Lanier, a Black Seabee who handled cargo during the Iwo Jima attack. "Everything comes by ships, everything, and somebody has to unload those ships." Black Marines and supply troops kept combat forces armed and fed and transported wounded men away from the island for care. Corporal Archibald Mosley and other Black Marines saw the flag raised on Iwo Jima, a scene immortalized by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal. It made the exhausted, battle-weary troops feel like the Marines were making some headway, but there was no time for rest. "We were still in the heat of battle," Mosley said. "After the flag was raised, we just went back to work." Albert Bryant continued to supply combat troops with ammunition after the flag was hoisted up. As shells shook the earth, his unit burrowed for cover, but the island's sand, a silty volcanic ash, filled in the small trenches as quickly as they dug. Some men suffocated in the collapsed foxholes. As the days of combat stretched into weeks, Black and white Marines fought side by side. "We were all Americans once the chips were down," Bryant recalled. While Black Marines witnessed the Stars and Stripes go up, many felt like they were written out of the history of the battle and the war. The Marines who climbed Mount Suribachi and raised the flag may not have climbed the mountain or won the war without the efforts of support personnel, Mosley argued. Black Marines in the Pacific, as well as Black Americans in other theaters, described white photographers and newsreel cameramen turning their lenses away when Black troops were in view. Black newspapers and civil rights leaders railed against this erasure. The Norfolk Journal and Guide declared, "The seeming enthusiasm with which major newsreel companies delete any and all scenes showing the Negro, they're giving movie audiences the impression that there are no Negroes in this war. The major weekly and monthly white magazines are guilty of the same tragic omission. Were it not for the Negro press, the American public would be unaware of the contribution and sacrifices of our people in this global war." The NAACP's Walter White saw the erasure of Black troops as having dire post-war consequences. He said, "All of us are deeply concerned at the appalling lack of information among white Americans regarding the enormous part the Negroes playing in the fighting of the war, despite the handicaps he encounters. It is our measured belief that when the war ends, there will be a great deal of opposition to the Negroes sharing the benefits of victory, unless every possible means is utilized to publicize what the Negro is doing." In the summer of 1945, as many Americans celebrated the end of the war, Black veterans returned to a country that disrespected their service and was openly hostile to them and their communities. Navy messman and Guadalcanal veteran Wallace Baptiste was proudly wearing his uniform with ribbons and battle stars when he boarded a ferry in New Orleans just after the war ended. Baptiste said, "I sat down on one of the benches, and this old rebel, who was down about 60 feet away at the other end of the bench, demands the operator that I be removed from his bench. I didn't need any trouble. I went ahead and moved. I just wanted to get home. I was lucky to be home at all after the Solomons, but that really dampened my spirits." Across the South, Black veterans faced deadly violence, not by Japanese or German soldiers, but from their own countrymen. The New York Amsterdam News argued that every Negro with this country's uniform on is a refutation of the Southern racial caste system. Black newspapers carried grim news of the campaign of terror against Black veterans and said the names of the victims. Isaac Woodard, a Pacific Theater veteran, was still wearing his Army uniform in February 1946 when he was beaten by white police in Batesburg, South Carolina, while en route to rejoin his family. His eyes were gouged out by the sheriff's nightstick, blinding him for life. Woodard traveled the country speaking about his experience and calling for the Truman administration to protect Black Americans and desegregate the military. Negro veterans that fought in this war don't realize that the real battle has just begun in America, Woodard argued. They went overseas and did their duty, and now they're home and have to fight another struggle that I think outweighs the war. George Dorsey, who served several years in the Pacific, had been home for less than a year when he, his wife, and their friends were shot 60 times at close range by a white mob in Walton County of Georgia in July of 1946. Dorothy Malcolm, his wife, was 7 months pregnant when she was lynched. In August 1946, Maceo Snipes, an Army veteran who served in the Pacific, was shot and killed by 4 KKK members who came to his farmhouse the day after Snipes became the first Black person to vote in a Democratic primary in Taylor County, Georgia. The New York Amsterdam News called Snipes a new martyr in the cause for democracy and freedom in America. New York Amsterdam News war correspondent Dan Burley told readers that even though Black troops established an impressive record in every theater of the war, the bigger battle began when they returned home. He wrote, "The veteran from Okinawa may well be lynched on the streets of a Georgia town, if he does not step off the sidewalk when a white woman or man passes. He had better not wear his uniform or battle ribbons in certain towns in Mississippi." For Black Americans, this post-war reign of terror against veterans made victory parades and talk of American democracy ring hollow. Racial violence against Black people was not new, but seeing lives taken so regularly, so casually, and so carelessly made it clear that these were not isolated examples of bad cops or racist citizens, but rather a pattern of violence that demonstrated that the country did not equally value Black lives. Let me conclude by emphasizing that the stories we choose to tell about the past matter. This is especially true for World War II. Stories of the war that do not reckon with the Black American experience leave us ill-prepared to understand the present and rudderless as we try to navigate the future. Ignorance is a luxury we cannot afford. If we tell the right stories about the war, we can meet the resurgence of white supremacy as a deeply entrenched aspect of our country's political history and cultural life, rather than a surprise or anomaly. If we tell the right stories about the war, we can see modern racial justice activism as the continuation of decades-long struggles to make America an actual functioning democracy. And if we tell the right stories about the war, we can finally honor the sacrifices of the Black veterans, defense industry workers, and citizens who fought on foreign battlefields and in their own cities and towns so that no one would ever again be treated as half American. Thank you.